Hello and welcome, dear listener. Where in the world are you joining me from tonight? And what time is it right now, where you are? I'd love for you to share in the comments, so together we can see how far across the globe this story travels. Here on this channel, I bring you long, soothing stories from history, myths, and legends. Narratives designed to calm your mind, inspire your imagination, and help you drift into peace. If you enjoy these journeys, don't forget to subscribe and like this video so more listeners can join us. Now, let's step into our story together. In the hush of twilight, when the lamps of Kyoto's wooden houses flickered against the evening mist, the world of old Japan prepared itself for an age of profound transformation. Before the rise of the geisha, before the whisper of silk kimonos in lantern-lit alleys, and the strum of the shamisen echoed through narrow streets, there was another Japan. Raw, unpolished, and brimming with the contradictions of tradition and change. To understand the creation of the geisha, one must first walk back to this earlier time, when the seeds of their world were first sown. Japan in the 16th and 17th centuries was a nation in flux. After generations of warfare among feudal lords, the land had finally begun to experience a semblance of stability. The Tokugawa shogunate, established in 1603, brought a new order to the country. Peace, for the first time in centuries, created the conditions for urban life to flourish. Cities like Kyoto, Osaka, and Edo swelled with merchants, craftsmen, and wandering entertainers. The warrior class, once consumed by the chaos of endless battles, now turned its gaze toward culture, leisure, and pleasure. It was within this atmosphere that the licensed pleasure districts, known as yukaku, emerged. These districts were not simply places of indulgence, but carefully regulated zones where art, performance, fashion, and sensuality mingled. Among the most famous was Yoshiwara in Edo, an enclosed neighborhood that became the beating heart of the floating world, or ukiyo. Here, courtesans dressed in dazzling silks received wealthy patrons, and tea houses buzzed with conversation, poetry, and music. Yet alongside the courtesans, another class of entertainers began to appear. Figures whose role was not to sell love, but to create atmosphere, to weave joy into the air through wit, music, and charm. These were the precursors to the geisha. In their earliest form, geisha were not women at all. They were men, often called taikomochi, or drum bearers, entertainers who served a role similar to jesters in European courts. Skilled in storytelling, in music, in games and banter. They accompanied wealthy patrons to banquets and drinking houses. Their task was to lighten the evening, to keep conversation lively, and to provide an air of sophistication and merriment. With painted faces and colorful robes, they moved between performances and witty repartee, ensuring no silence lingered too long in the banquet halls. But times were changing. As the 17th century advanced, women began to take up the same roles. Unlike the courtesans, whose allure was primarily sensual, these women focused on art, music, and dance. Their presence brought a different atmosphere to the evening, softer and more graceful, yet equally captivating. Slowly, the balance tipped. By the 18th century, women entertainers had eclipsed their male counterparts, and the figure of the female geisha, the person of the arts, emerged fully into the world. To truly understand why this shift occurred, one must consider the nature of Edo period society. The Tokugawa shogunate was rigid stratified, and conservative. Yet within its tightly bound social order, there existed small spaces where freedom and playfulness could bloom. The pleasure quarters, though confined by walls and gates, offered an escape from the burdens of status and duty. Inside, a merchant could converse with a samurai, a poet with a courtesan, a scholar with an entertainer. Within these fleeting nights, hierarchy loosened, and beauty, wit, and artistry became the true currency. The geisha arose to embody precisely this ephemeral spirit. They were artists of the floating world, sculptors of atmosphere. Their role was to soothe, to charm, to engage, and to remind their guests that life, however fleeting, could be luminous, delicate, and filled with art. Unlike the courtesans who promised intimacy, the geisha offered an art of presence. The tilt of a head, the brush of a sleeve, the plucked note of a shamisen string that lingered in the mind long after the banquet ended. Even in these early years, their lives were shaped by rules. The authorities, fearful of blurring the lines between courtesan and geisha, established clear boundaries. A geisha was not to sell her body. Her realm was that of art and entertainment. She could sing, she could dance, she could play drinking games, she could make conversation that left men smiling long after they left the tea house. But she was not to trespass into the territory of the courtesan. The boundaries were policed with fines and punishments, and for the most part, they held. Thus, the geisha carved a unique place for themselves, distinct yet complementary to the world of licensed pleasure. The early geisha were few in number, scattered across the districts of Kyoto and Edo. But their reputation spread quickly. Patrons spoke of their wit, their elegance, their ability to shift the mood of a gathering from dull to sparkling. A samurai returning from service could sit with a geisha and find his burdens lightened by her laughter. A merchant, wearied by the day's calculations, might forget his ledgers in the presence of her song. They were not wives, nor courtesans, nor servants. They were something different, something ephemeral yet essential. In the flickering lamplight of these first gatherings, the figure of the geisha was born. She would become, in time, one of the most enduring symbols of Japanese culture. But in those earliest days, she was simply a woman of art, stepping softly into a world that had not yet realized how much it needed her. The rise of the geisha cannot be separated from the rhythm of city life in early Edo period Japan. When peace took root under the Tokugawa shogunate, cities grew like never before. Edo, a small fishing village at the end of the 16th century, transformed into one of the largest cities in the world by the 18th. Kyoto, the imperial capital, remained the seat of tradition and courtly refinement, while Osaka became a hub of commerce and culture. Within these vibrant urban centers, new forms of entertainment were born to meet the desires of an increasingly diverse population. The common people, especially merchants, now enjoyed a prosperity unknown to earlier generations. They were still placed at the bottom of the official social hierarchy, below samurai, peasants, and artisans. But wealth gave them influence, and influence demanded outlets of leisure. The floating world, ukiyo, became both a physical space and a state of mind. In the floating world, the harsh rules of society dissolved into laughter, music, and beauty. Time was suspended. Life was savored moment by moment. At the heart of this world stood the licensed quarters, enclosed neighborhoods where both restrictions and freedoms flourished side by side. The most celebrated was Yoshiwara in Edo, a district surrounded by walls and gates, entered only through appointed checkpoints. By law, all courtesans and entertainers had to reside within these districts, ensuring that pleasure could be carefully observed and taxed by the authorities. Yet for the patrons who walked beneath Yoshiwara's lanterns, it was a realm apart from ordinary life. There, the fire of art burned more brightly than anywhere else in Japan. Courtesans, known as oiran, ruled the streets of Yoshiwara in the early years. Adorned in elaborate layers of silk, with hairstyles piled high and glittering with combs and ornaments, they were living works of art. Their processions through the district were theatrical events, watched by commoners as though they were parades. To spend an evening with an oiran was to step into a carefully staged world of elegance and allure. But their lives were demanding. Bound to contracts, they endured long hours of work and limited freedom. And for many, their beauty faded quickly under the weight of expectation. It was within this glittering yet rigid world that geisha began to carve out a new identity. Unlike the oiran, whose art was intertwined with sensual companionship, the geisha placed art itself at the center. Their dances were lighter, their music more playful, their conversation sharper and freer of burden. Patrons found in them a refreshing alternative. Companionship without the heavy formalities of a courtesan, charm without the expense of elaborate rituals, laughter that felt as spontaneous as it was skillful. The authorities recognized the appeal of these entertainers, but also the potential for disorder. Regulations were drawn to make clear distinctions. Geisha were forbidden from dressing as lavishly as the oiran. Their kimonos were to be elegant but restrained, their hairstyles simpler, their manner more understated. The purpose was to ensure that the geisha did not compete directly with the courtesans for clients. Yet, paradoxically, these very restrictions helped shape the refined and graceful image of the geisha that would endure for centuries. While oiran dazzled with extravagance, geisha captivated with subtlety. Where the courtesan's power lay in spectacle, the geisha's lay in suggestion. Her beauty was enhanced by simplicity. The pale face, the black hair smooth and shining, the soft whisper of silk as she moved across the tatami floor. She was a presence, not a promise. And in that presence, men discovered a form of solace that did not exist elsewhere. Training was essential. Even in these early stages, geisha were expected to master the arts of performance and etiquette. They studied shamisen, the three-stringed instrument whose sound could be both piercing and melancholy. They learned the delicate movements of traditional dance, where every turn of the wrist and angle of the foot carried meaning. They memorized songs and poems, practiced the art of witty conversation, and trained in the ceremonies of tea and sake. To be a geisha was not simply to appear beautiful, but to become an embodiment of grace, discipline, and cultural knowledge. These skills distinguished the geisha from other women in society. In an era when most women's lives were confined to the household, the geisha existed in a sphere of their own. They could converse with samurai and merchants, scholars and poets. They could move between classes, transcending boundaries that ordinary women could not cross. They were, in many ways, a paradox. Highly restricted by rules, yet uniquely free in the breadth of their social interactions. The geisha also mirrored the contradictions of the floating world itself. Their existence was fleeting, tied to youth and beauty, yet their art carried timeless qualities. They lived lives of strict discipline, yet were seen as symbols of play and ease. They were celebrated as icons of femininity, yet their world was shaped by economic necessity and the demands of patrons. As the 17th century turned toward the 18th, the presence of female geisha grew steadily. Male entertainers, once dominant, began to fade into the background. The laughter they had once inspired was now more often carried by women in pale makeup and silk. Patrons preferred the elegance of female geisha, and the culture of the floating world adapted accordingly. By the middle of the 18th century, the geisha had become an institution as essential to the entertainment districts as the tea houses and theaters themselves. But the early years were still fragile. Geisha had to walk carefully within the boundaries set for them. A geisha who blurred the line between entertainer and courtesan risked punishment, and sometimes entire houses were fined if one of their women stepped beyond the permitted role. Yet within these boundaries, creativity thrived. The art of being a geisha lay in evoking enchantment without crossing into forbidden territory. It was an art of balance, of knowing how far to go and when to stop, of creating intimacy without possession, of offering beauty without surrender. For the guests who sought their company, geisha became more than entertainers. They were confidants, muses, and companions for an evening. They created an illusion of timelessness, where the weight of duty and status could be forgotten, if only for a few hours. A merchant might feel like a poet in their presence. A weary samurai might rediscover laughter he had long abandoned. Geisha embodied the promise of the floating world itself, that life, no matter how brief or constrained, could be illuminated by moments of grace. And so, in the dim light of paper lanterns, in the hushed rooms of tea houses, and in the laughter that rose above the sound of shamisen strings, the geisha began her journey from novelty to necessity. Her art was not yet fully defined, but the outline was clear. She was to become the living embodiment of refinement, the soul of the fleeting world, a figure who could turn an ordinary evening into a memory that lingered like the echo of a distant song. The floating world was never a fixed reality. It was a dream, a carefully constructed illusion of beauty, laughter, and escape. And within that illusion, the figure of the geisha slowly began to crystallize. By the early 18th century, her presence had become a fixture of the entertainment districts. Yet she was still a newcomer in a world dominated by the courtesans. To survive, she needed to refine her role, to distinguish herself more sharply, to show patrons that what she offered was not competition, but complement. It is here that one can see the artistry of the geisha's emergence. Rather than challenge the oiran directly, geisha created a parallel identity, one that seemed lighter, freer, and closer to the spirit of play. Courtesans required elaborate rituals, introductions through intermediaries, expensive gifts, and endless layers of formality before intimacy was permitted. The geisha, by contrast, offered something more immediate: the sparkle of wit, the pleasure of music, the warmth of laughter. She was not the distant star in a procession, but the moonlit glow in a quiet room, close enough to share a cup of sake with. This shift in atmosphere was deliberate. Patrons, especially merchants and younger samurai, began to prefer the company of geisha because the evenings felt less burdened by formality. They could laugh without restraint, speak without the weight of rigid etiquette, and enjoy companionship that felt spontaneous rather than staged. The authorities, always watchful, continued to impose restrictions. Geisha must wear plainer clothing, their hairstyles must not rival those of the courtesans, and their houses must register separately from brothels. But these restrictions only strengthened the distinction, sharpening the geisha's image as a woman of art rather than seduction. Training became the key to sustaining this identity. The path to becoming a geisha often began in childhood. Young girls, usually from poor families, were sold or apprenticed into an ukiyo, a geisha house managed by a woman known as the okesan, literally the mother. Life within the ukiyo was demanding. From dawn until dusk, apprentices practiced the arts: shamisen, flute, drums, traditional dance, singing, poetry, and the intricacies of tea ceremony. They memorized games, studied manners, and learned how to carry themselves with grace. Every movement, from how to pour sake to how to walk across tatami mats, was rehearsed until it became second nature. At first, these girls were called shikomi, servants in training who performed household tasks while observing their seniors. After years of practice, they advanced to the stage of maiko, or dancing child. A maiko was instantly recognizable by her elaborate kimono, long dangling obi, and ornate hairstyle decorated with seasonal ornaments. She was youthful, vibrant, and still learning. Her role was to accompany senior geisha, watch, imitate, and slowly master the art of entertainment. The transformation from maiko to geisha was marked by rituals that could take years to complete. When the time came, the maiko adopted the more subdued elegance of a full geisha. Her kimono grew simpler, her hairstyle less ornate, her movements calmer and more precise. She was no longer defined by the brightness of youth, but by the depth of refinement. If the maiko was a blossoming flower, the geisha was the bloom in its perfection. This apprenticeship system created a lineage of knowledge. Skills were passed down not through books or schools, but through daily practice, imitation, and correction within the walls of the ukiyo. It was a world of discipline, where failure to meet expectations meant punishment, and where debts bound the young women to the house until they could earn enough to buy their freedom. Yet within this strictness lay an extraordinary cultivation of art. The geisha became living vessels of tradition, their bodies trained to embody music, dance, and elegance in ways that could not easily be taught elsewhere. The presence of geisha began to extend beyond the walls of yoshiwara and other licensed quarters. They appeared in tea houses, in private banquets, in seasonal festivals. Their popularity grew because they represented not indulgence, but refinement. For many patrons, to host a gathering with geisha was a mark of sophistication, a display of taste rather than mere wealth. In Kyoto, particularly in the district of Gion, geisha culture took on a distinctive character. There, the emphasis on art was even stronger, and the traditions of dance and music reached heights of subtlety and grace. Gion would, in time, become the symbolic home of geisha, a place where their presence was most revered and their arts most carefully preserved. The cobblestone alleys, lined with wooden tea houses and lanterns, seemed to hold within them the very essence of the floating world. Meanwhile, in Edo, the demand for entertainment expanded as the city grew into a metropolis. The number of geisha houses increased, and with them, competition. Each ukiyo sought to distinguish its women through particular talents, some specializing in music, others in dance, others in witty repartee. Reputation was everything. A geisha who gained fame could command high fees, attract powerful patrons, and bring prosperity to her house. Yet success came with risks. A geisha who attracted too much attention might draw suspicion from authorities or jealousy from rivals. Scandals could erupt if boundaries with courtesans were blurred, or if a patron demanded more than was permitted. The life of a geisha was thus a delicate balance between art and business, between freedom and restraint, between self-expression and obedience. The paradox deepened as geisha became more central to the culture of the floating world. They were celebrated as icons of refinement, yet their personal lives were tightly controlled by the ukiyo. They were praised for their independence of spirit, yet they lived under financial debts and social rules that bound them. They moved freely between classes in the entertainment halls, yet outside those halls they were often marginalized by the rigid hierarchy of society. Still, their art gave them a form of power that few women of the time possessed. A geisha could converse with a daimyo, a wealthy merchant, or a poet as an equal, her wit and charm giving her a voice in conversations otherwise closed to women. Some geisha became confidants to influential men, shaping opinions and even political decisions behind the scenes. Their influence, though subtle, was real, and it added to the aura of mystery that surrounded their world. By the mid-18th century, the distinction was clear. Courtesans offered intimacy. Geisha offered art. Courtesans dazzled in the streets with their parades. Geisha illuminated the quiet rooms of tea houses. Courtesans were bound to contracts of the flesh. Geisha were bound to the elegance of performance. Both belonged to the floating world, yet each carried its own essence. And in that difference lay the reason for the geisha's survival, long after the courtesans faded from prominence. The stage was now set for the geisha to rise as a cultural institution in her own right. No longer a shadow to the oiran, she would become the face of refinement, the soul of fleeting beauty, the keeper of arts that spoke to the heart of Japan itself. The floating world had found its muse, and her name was Geisha. The 18th century was a period of crystallization. By now, the geisha had stepped firmly into the fabric of urban Japanese life, no longer merely a curiosity, but a recognized profession. Their place in the entertainment districts was secured, their image increasingly refined, their role both celebrated and carefully monitored. The floating world was evolving, and the geisha stood at its luminous center. In the beginning, the geisha had been defined largely by what they were not. They were not courtesans, not wives, not servants. Their boundaries were drawn in negative space, shaped by restrictions and prohibitions. But as the decades passed, their art began to speak for itself, carving out a positive identity that went beyond definitions of exclusion. They became women of culture, of poise, of grace. A class of entertainers whose presence was desired not for physical intimacy, but for the atmosphere they created. Central to this transformation was the codification of rules and customs. The authorities of the Tokugawa shogunate, ever mindful of maintaining order, issued regulations to protect the separation of roles. Geisha were forbidden from competing directly with courtesans in matters of appearance or sexual services. Yet within these rules, geisha crafted a distinct aesthetic. Their kimono, while elegant, were designed to emphasize refinement rather than opulence. Their makeup was subtle, their hairstyles graceful but restrained. Where the courtesan dazzled with spectacle, the geisha enchanted with suggestion. This aesthetic aligned perfectly with broader currents in Japanese art and philosophy. Simplicity, subtlety, and suggestion had long been prized in poetry, painting, and tea ceremony. The geisha embodied these ideals in human form. A glance, a pause, the faint sound of a shamisen string. It was enough to evoke entire worlds of feeling. In this way, geisha were not only entertainers, but living expressions of cultural values deeply rooted in Japan's aesthetic sensibilities. Life within the ukiyo continued to shape the development of geisha culture. The ukiyo was both home and institution, a place of discipline and debt, but also of training and tradition. Every geisha belonged to an ukiyo, overseen by an okasan who managed finances, arranged engagements, and ensured obedience to the rules. Young apprentices grew up in this environment, watching, learning, and absorbing the ways of their seniors. Bonds of sisterhood formed among the women, though competition and hierarchy often made those relationships complex. Debts were a constant reality. The cost of training, clothing, and daily expenses was borne by the ukiyo, and a geisha was expected to repay these through her earnings. Some women spent years working to free themselves from financial obligations, while others remained tied to their houses indefinitely. Yet success stories existed. Geisha who became renowned, attracted wealthy patrons, and eventually achieved independence. These women became legends within their districts, their names whispered with admiration in tea houses and streets alike. The daily life of a geisha was filled with both rigor and ritual. Mornings began with lessons, music, dance, tea ceremony, or calligraphy. Afternoons might be spent preparing for evening engagements, dressing in kimono that required skill and patience to assemble. Nights brought the real work. Attending banquets, performing in tea houses, conversing with guests, and maintaining the delicate balance of charm and restraint that defined their role. Sleep was often short, and the cycle repeated endlessly. Despite the demands, many geisha took pride in their art. To master a shamisen piece, to perfect a dance, to hold a room captive with nothing more than a smile and a story. These were achievements that gave meaning to their lives. In a society where women were often confined to domestic spheres, the geisha's visibility and influence, though limited by strictures, offered a form of empowerment rarely available elsewhere. The patrons of geisha were as varied as the society they inhabited. Samurai seeking respite from duty, merchants flaunting their prosperity, poets and artists seeking inspiration, all found in geisha a companionship that was as much intellectual as it was emotional. To sit with a geisha was to enter a space where art and conversation intertwined, where the outside world seemed to fade into the soft glow of lanterns and the rhythm of shamisen music. Yet the relationship between patron and geisha was not without complexity. While geisha were forbidden to sell intimacy, arrangements known as dana, patronage, sometimes blurred the lines. A dana was typically a wealthy man who provided financial support to a geisha, covering her expenses and debts in exchange for exclusivity of companionship. These relationships varied widely. Some remained within the realm of art and companionship, while others grew more personal. The existence of the dana reinforced the delicate balance geisha had to maintain between independence and dependence, art and economy. In the cultural imagination of the time, geisha began to acquire symbolic weight. They were not merely entertainers, but figures who represented the fleeting beauty of the floating world. Ukiyo prints captured their images, freezing them in woodblock ink as emblems of elegance. Writers wove them into stories and plays, their presence evoking themes of impermanence, longing, and aesthetic delight. The geisha became muses for an entire generation of artists, their lives mirrored in the broader artistic currents of Edo Japan. This intertwining of geisha culture with art reinforced their legitimacy. They were no longer seen only as performers in pleasure quarters, but as bearers of cultural heritage. The tea ceremony they practiced linked them to centuries of tradition. The dances they performed echoed ancient court rituals. The music they played drew from folk traditions and elite artistry alike. In embodying these arts, geisha became cultural custodians as much as entertainers. Still, challenges persisted. Rivalries with courtesans sometimes flared, disputes with authorities could bring penalties, and the precariousness of patronage meant that fortunes could rise and fall quickly. For every celebrated geisha who achieved fame and prosperity, there were many more who lived quietly in the shadows, their names forgotten by history. Yet it was precisely this mixture of brilliance and obscurity, of success and struggle, that gave the world of geisha its depth and complexity. By the close of the 18th century, the foundation had been laid. The geisha was no longer an emergent figure, but an established presence. She had survived the scrutiny of authorities, distinguished herself from courtesans, and earned a place in the imagination of Japan. Her art was recognized, her role defined, her image immortalized in print and performance. The floating world had found its voice, and that voice sang through the geisha's song, danced through her movement, and lingered in the silence after her laughter faded. The story of the geisha was only beginning. Greater challenges lay ahead: modernization, Western influence, the upheavals of war. But before all that, there was this moment, a time when she stood at the height of her emergence, a symbol of beauty, refinement, and fleeting joy in a world that sought to capture eternity within the span of a single evening. As the 18th century drew toward its close, the image of the geisha had become deeply woven into the cultural fabric of Japan, no longer a novelty confined to the entertainment districts. The geisha was now an institution, an established figure whose presence shaped the very rhythm of leisure and art. To trace her path from obscurity to prominence is to witness the birth of a tradition that would endure for centuries, adapting and transforming with the tides of history. The floating world of Edo Japan was itself a fragile construct. Built upon the peace of the Tokugawa shogunate, it flourished precisely because the samurai no longer lived by the sword. With warfare suspended, energy turned toward culture, commerce, and spectacle. The entertainment quarters were both the product and the symbol of this shift. Carefully regulated spaces that allowed controlled indulgence. Within their gates, the rigid order of society loosened, and men of every class found themselves participants in the shared pursuit of beauty and amusement. In this world, the geisha had defined herself through contrast. She was not the courtesan in her towering finery, bound by layers of ritual before intimacy could be granted. She was not the wife, tied to duty and household. She was not the servant, lacking agency. She was, instead, a figure of presence, an artist of the moment, weaving music, dance, and laughter into the fabric of an evening. In her company, patrons discovered the possibility of escape, not through possession, but through enchantment. The atmosphere of a geisha's gathering, an ozashiki, was unlike any other. Guests would gather in a tatami-matted room, the scent of incense faint in the air, the glow of lanterns soft against the sliding paper doors. The geisha entered quietly, her steps measured, her silk kimono whispering with each movement. She bowed, served sake, and began to speak, her words chosen with care, her tone light but attentive. The conversation flowed, interwoven with music from the shamisen, with song that spoke of seasons and love, with dances that traced patterns of elegance across the floor. It was an art of atmosphere, one that required as much discipline as any theatrical performance. For while it seemed effortless, every gesture was the result of years of training. To pour sake gracefully, to strum a shamisen with perfect timing, to offer a witty remark that lifted the spirits of the table. These were skills honed through endless practice. The geisha's genius lay not in spectacle, but in subtlety, in making the difficult appear natural, in allowing her guests to believe that joy had arisen spontaneously, though it had been crafted with the care of a poet. This mastery of atmosphere distinguished the geisha from all other entertainers. Actors performed upon stages, musicians upon platforms, courtesans in their chambers. But the geisha performed in the midst of her guests, her art woven seamlessly into the fabric of conversation and companionship. She did not merely entertain. She transformed the ordinary into the memorable, the fleeting into the eternal. By the late 18th century, this role had become so valued that geisha were increasingly sought not only in the pleasure quarters, but in the wider circles of urban life. They appeared at seasonal festivals, at private gatherings of poets and scholars, even at political banquets. Their presence was a mark of refinement, a signal that the host valued not just wealth, but culture. To invite geisha was to announce oneself as a man of taste, a participant in the higher currents of urban society. Yet the expansion of their role brought new challenges. Authorities remained vigilant, issuing fresh regulations to ensure that geisha did not transgress boundaries. Geisha houses were required to register, their activities monitored, their attire and conduct controlled. These measures reflected both suspicion and recognition. Suspicion that geisha might disrupt social order. Recognition that they had become too significant to ignore. For the geisha themselves, the late 18th century was a time of both opportunity and hardship. Opportunities lay in the growing demand for their services, the possibility of fame, the chance to attract powerful patrons. Hardship lay in the relentless demands of training, the burden of debt, the uncertainty of patronage, and the ever-present scrutiny of officials. Success could bring independence and renown. Failure could mean obscurity, exhaustion, and poverty. And yet, within these constraints, geisha continued to embody the spirit of the floating world. Their art thrived precisely because it was fleeting, because each evening was unique, because the beauty they created could never be held, only remembered. They lived in the realm of impermanence, and in doing so, they became symbols of impermanence itself, symbols that resonated deeply with Japanese cultural ideals. It is here, at the threshold of the 19th century, that the geisha can be seen most clearly in her emergent form. She was no longer the shadow of the courtesan, no longer defined solely by what she was not. She was the woman of art, the keeper of refinement, the embodiment of grace. She had carved out a role that was both distinct and indispensable, one that would carry her into the modern age. The courtesans, though still resplendent, would in time fade, their rituals and extravagance increasingly out of step with the changing currents of society. But the geisha, with her subtlety, her adaptability, and her focus on art, would endure. Her presence would survive the upheavals of modernization, the pressures of Western influence, even the devastations of war. She would change, of course, every tradition does, but she would not vanish. The story of geisha is, in truth, the story of survival through transformation. Born in the shadows of the floating world, shaped by restrictions and contradictions, they turned limitations into strengths, simplicity into elegance, fleeting moments into lasting symbols. Their world was fragile, but within its fragility lay resilience. Thus, as the 18th century ended, the stage was set for the chapters to come. The geisha had emerged. She was ready to step into the spotlight of history, to carry her arts into new centuries, to embody both the beauty of the past and the possibilities of the future. The floating world had given birth to its most enduring muse, and her song was only just beginning. The 18th century marked a turning point in the evolution of the geisha. What had begun as a profession dominated by male entertainers gradually transformed into one led by women. By the mid-17th century, the presence of female geisha had become increasingly common in the pleasure quarters of Kyoto, Osaka, and Edo. Patrons found their presence more captivating than that of the male taikomochi. And slowly but surely, the balance shifted. The era of the female geisha had begun. The reasons for this transformation were many. At its heart lay the subtle but undeniable power of women in shaping atmosphere. The grace of a bow, the softness of a smile, the delicate elegance of movement. These qualities created a sense of refinement that male entertainers could not easily replicate. Patrons sought not only laughter and conversation, but the charm of feminine presence, the quiet resonance of a woman's artistry. And in a society where women's roles were often confined, the geisha's sphere offered a unique space where femininity could be cultivated as art. It is important to remember that the rise of female geisha did not occur in isolation. It unfolded within the complex world of the yukaku, the licensed pleasure quarters. These districts were carefully regulated spaces, designed both to contain indulgence and to profit from it. Courtesans still held a powerful place within them, but their role was increasingly challenged by shifting tastes. The elaborate rituals required to meet with a high-ranking oiran, the processions, the costly gifts, the long delays before intimacy, felt burdensome to many patrons. In contrast, the company of a geisha offered lightness and immediacy. The evening could begin with music and laughter, unencumbered by rigid ceremony. By the late 18th century, the presence of female geisha had become so prominent that male entertainers were reduced to near obscurity. A few remained, often in supporting roles. But the world of geisha, had been transformed into a world of women. This transition carried with it profound implications, reshaping not only the entertainment districts, but also the cultural imagination of Japan. The female geisha refined the profession into something far beyond entertainment. She became the embodiment of a carefully constructed ideal, poised yet playful, disciplined yet spontaneous, graceful yet witty. She was not merely a woman, but a work of art, a living vessel of music, dance, and refinement. To encounter her was to experience not only companionship, but a vision of elegance itself. Training for this role became formalized. Young girls, often from poor families, were apprenticed into ukiyo, geisha houses, where they lived under the supervision of the okesan, the house mother. Their path was long and demanding, beginning with the role of shikomi, or servant in training. As shikomi, they cleaned, fetched, and carried, observing their seniors with careful eyes. Gradually, they absorbed the rhythms of the geisha's life. The early lessons, the endless rehearsals, the preparations for evening gatherings. When their training advanced, they underwent a transformation into maiko, apprentice geisha. The maiko embodied youth and blossoming beauty. Her kimono was lavish, her obi long and trailing, her hair adorned with elaborate ornaments that changed with the seasons. Her role was to accompany senior geisha to banquets, to watch, to imitate, and to begin practicing her own arts under the guidance of mentors. The sight of a maiko, with her vibrant attire and youthful energy, became one of the most enchanting images of Kyoto's streets. The passage from maiko to geisha was marked by rituals of transition. A maiko's appearance gradually simplified as she matured. Her kimono became more subdued, her hairstyle more restrained, her demeanor calmer and more deliberate. In this transformation lay a profound symbolism, the journey from the brightness of youth to the elegance of refinement. If the maiko was a promise, the geisha was fulfillment. The arts they studied were varied and demanding. Shamisen remained central, its three strings capable of producing melodies that ranged from playful to melancholy. Dance, too, was essential, with each movement codified into patterns of meaning. A tilt of the head, a flick of the wrist, a measured step across the tatami. Each gesture was a language of its own. Singing, poetry, calligraphy, and the rituals of tea and sake completed their education. Every aspect of their lives was directed toward embodying grace. The result of this training was an art form unlike any other. The geisha was not an actress upon a stage, nor a musician in a concert hall. She was an artist of presence, performing within the intimate setting of a banquet or tea house. Her art was woven into the fabric of conversation, laughter, and companionship. It was never about spectacle alone, but about creating a seamless experience where every detail contributed to atmosphere. As female geisha grew in prominence, the authorities responded with new regulations to preserve boundaries. Geisha were forbidden from dressing too elaborately, from encroaching upon the courtesan's sphere, from selling intimacy. Yet these restrictions only further defined their role. By setting limits, the shogunate inadvertently sharpened the geisha's identity as women of art rather than desire. Their restrained elegance became a virtue, their subtlety a mark of refinement. The patrons embraced this distinction. A merchant hosting a gathering could impress his peers by inviting geisha, signaling not only wealth but taste. A samurai, weary from duty, could find solace in their company, enjoying a sense of lightness that contrasted with the severity of his daily life. Even poets and scholars sought inspiration from geisha, finding in their presence a harmony of art and intellect. By the close of the 18th century, the female geisha had fully supplanted her male predecessors. She was now the face of the profession, the muse of the floating world, the embodiment of refinement in a society that prized the fleeting beauty of the moment. Her rise signaled a new chapter, one that would carry the tradition into its golden age. The rise of the female geisha brought with it not only new opportunities, but also new systems of training, discipline, and identity. To become a geisha was not a matter of chance. It was the outcome of years of deliberate cultivation within the walls of the ukiyo. The apprenticeship of the maiko, in particular, became one of the most distinctive features of geisha culture, embodying both the hardships and the beauty of the profession. A young girl entering an ukiyo did not simply step into a new home. She entered into an entire world governed by tradition, hierarchy, and ritual. As a shikomi, or servant in training, she performed household duties, cleaning the tatami mats, preparing meals, assisting senior geisha with dressing and hair, and running errands through the narrow streets of the district. Her days were long and often exhausting, but this stage was crucial. It instilled discipline, obedience, and familiarity with the rhythms of the house. More importantly, it allowed her to observe, silently and attentively, the life of geisha. When she was deemed ready, she underwent the transformation into maiko. This transition was marked by ceremony, for it was not merely a change of clothing or hairstyle, but a passage into the visible world of performance. As a maiko, she became a symbol of youth, beauty, and potential. Her appearance was instantly recognizable. A kimono with long sleeves, brightly colored and adorned with seasonal motifs. An obi that trailed nearly to the floor, tied in elaborate knots. And hair styled into intricate shapes, decorated with combs and ornaments that reflected the time of year. The maiko's face was painted in the distinctive white makeup associated with geisha, but with variations that marked her stage of apprenticeship. Red and pink hues highlighted her youth, while her eyebrows and lips were painted with care to accentuate vibrancy. Her movements were lively, her laughter spontaneous, her demeanor infused with the freshness of youth. She was not yet the calm and restrained geisha, but a flower still unfolding, radiant in promise. The life of a maiko was one of constant training. Lessons filled her days: shamisen, singing, dance, tea ceremony, calligraphy, and the etiquette of conversation. Teachers demanded precision, correcting every mistake, guiding each gesture until it became instinct. Repetition was endless, for the arts of the seisha were not easily mastered. To hold a shamisen properly, to move in rhythm with a dance, to pour tea with elegance. Each required discipline and patience. Evenings brought her into the world of the osashiki, the banquets where geisha performed. At first, her role was to observe and assist, carrying trays of sake, refilling cups, and watching her seniors with attentive eyes. Gradually, she began to participate, offering greetings, playing simple melodies, dancing short pieces, and joining in the games that kept guests amused. Every banquet was a classroom, every guest an instructor, every moment an opportunity to learn. The relationship between maiko and senior geisha was central to this process. Each Maiko was paired with a mentor, known as Onisan, or older sister. The bond between them was formalized through a ceremony, after which the older sister guided, protected, and instructed her apprentice. The Onisan taught not only the technical arts, but also the subtler skills: how to read a guest's mood, how to respond to jokes with wit, how to carry oneself with dignity even when the evening grew late. In return, the Maiko honored her Onisan with loyalty and respect, often adopting parts of her name when she eventually debuted as a full geisha. This system of apprenticeship created continuity, binding generations of geisha into a living tradition. Each gesture carried the memory of countless women before. Each song echoed through decades of repetition. Each dance step traced a lineage that stretched back to the earliest performers. The world of the geisha was not written in books, but inscribed upon bodies, voices, and memories. Yet beneath the beauty of this system lay hardship. The life of a Maiko was demanding, and many did not complete the journey. The debts owed to the ukiyo were heavy, covering the cost of clothing, training, and daily living. Freedom was scarce. Every decision was shaped by the house and its rules. The hours were long, the demands unrelenting, the scrutiny constant. For some, the promise of refinement was overshadowed by exhaustion. Still, those who persevered found themselves transformed. The transition from Maiko to geisha was gradual but profound. As a Maiko matured, her attire simplified. The bright colors gave way to more subdued tones, the long trailing obi shortened, the elaborate hair ornaments diminished. Her makeup shifted too, with less emphasis on youthful vibrancy and more on calm elegance. Her demeanor grew quieter, her laughter more measured, her movements more deliberate. In these changes lay the passage from promise to fulfillment, from student to master, from flower to bloom. The moment of debut as a full geisha was celebrated within the district. It was both a personal triumph and a continuation of tradition, another thread woven into the tapestry of the floating world. The young woman, once a servant and then an apprentice, now stood as an artist in her own right, ready to carry the arts of the geisha into future evenings of music, dance, and conversation. The strict rules that governed this journey ensured the survival of the profession. By forbidding geisha from selling intimacy, by regulating their appearance, by structuring their apprenticeship, the authorities and the ukiyo together preserved the geisha as a distinct figure within the entertainment world. Without these boundaries, the geisha might have been absorbed into the broader category of courtesans, their arts lost within the commerce of desire. Instead, the rules sharpened their identity, anchoring them as women of art. For the guests, the presence of a Maiko or geisha brought layers of meaning. The Maiko embodied youth, vibrancy, and the promise of future refinement. She reminded them of the beauty of beginnings, of spring blossoms, of fleeting moments that dazzled before they faded. The geisha, by contrast, embodied maturity, calm, and fulfillment. She was the autumn moon, serene and luminous, her beauty not in exuberance, but in restraint. Together, Maiko and geisha created a spectrum of experience, a dialogue between youth and maturity, promise and perfection, impermanence and endurance. This dialogue resonated deeply with Japanese cultural ideals. The concept of mono no aware, the gentle sadness at the transience of things, was embodied in the lives of geisha. Their beauty was fleeting, their careers often short, their presence ephemeral, And yet, it was precisely this impermanence that made them precious. To share an evening with a geisha was to touch something that could never be repeated, to hold a memory that would fade even as it lingered. By the end of the 18th century, the apprenticeship of the maiko and the role of the geisha had become firmly established. The world of the floating quarters had crystallized its traditions, setting patterns that would endure into the modern age. The geisha was now an icon, both real and symbolic, her image etched into prints, poems, and plays. She was no longer merely part of the floating world. She was its essence, its muse, its living embodiment. The late 18th century was a time of definition. The geisha had risen from the shadows of the pleasure quarters to become a recognized presence. Yet her identity remained fragile, caught between admiration and suspicion. To survive, her role needed to be clarified, not only in the minds of patrons, but also in the eyes of the authorities. It was during this period that rules, restrictions, and cultural expectations began to carve the contours of what it meant to be a geisha. The most important distinction was that between the geisha and the courtesan, or oiran. For the authorities of the Tokugawa shogunate, this boundary was essential. The license quarters existed to contain and regulate sensual indulgence, and the courtesans were central to that purpose. To allow the geisha to encroach upon this sphere would have disrupted the delicate balance of commerce, taxation, and social order. Thus, laws were issued to draw sharp lines. Geisha were not to sell intimacy, nor to dress with the extravagance of courtesans, nor to appear in the same contexts as them. At first glance, these restrictions might have seemed limiting. Yet, paradoxically, they gave geisha their freedom. By forbidding them from acting as courtesans, the authorities opened the possibility for geisha to cultivate an entirely different identity, one centered not on desire, but on art. Where the courtesan's allure lay in sensuality and spectacle, the geishas lay in refinement, wit, and atmosphere. This distinction became the cornerstone of geisha culture, preserved through centuries of change. The rules governing appearance were especially important. Courtesans dressed in layered silks, their kimonos richly embroidered, their hairstyles towering constructions of combs and ornaments. Their very presence was theatrical, designed to dazzle onlookers as they paraded through the streets. Geisha, by contrast, were required to adopt restraint. Their kimono, while elegant, were less ostentatious. Their hairstyles, though carefully arranged, were simpler. Their ornaments were chosen for subtlety rather than extravagance. These differences created two distinct aesthetics: the courtesan as spectacle, the geisha as suggestion. This contrast carried into behavior as well. Courtesans engaged in rituals of introduction and negotiation, their company secured through costly and time-consuming processes. Geisha, on the other hand, could be invited more readily. Their role was to enliven gatherings, to provide music, dance, and conversation that lifted the spirits of guests. The difference was not merely practical, but philosophical. Courtesans promised possession. Geisha offered presence. Courtesans belonged to contracts. Geisha to moments. The geisha's identity was further shaped by the apprenticeship system. The transformation from shikomi to maiko to geisha was itself a series of boundaries, each marked by ritual, each reinforcing the idea that a geisha was not born but made. Her art was not innate but cultivated, her grace not natural, but disciplined. This deliberate cultivation distinguished her from women of other spheres, giving her an aura of refinement that patrons valued highly. Debt remained a central feature of this system. The cost of training, clothing, and living was borne by the ukiyo, and the young woman repaid it through her earnings as a geisha. This debt bound her to the house, ensuring loyalty and discipline. Yet it also underscored the economic realities of the profession. Behind the elegance of banquets and dances lay a world of financial transactions, obligations, and calculations. The geisha was both artist and commodity, celebrated for her refinement, yet dependent on the flow of patronage for survival. The presence of patrons, dana, complicated this balance further. A dana was typically a wealthy man who supported a geisha financially, paying her debts, providing for her needs, and often granting her a measure of independence from the ukiyo. These relationships varied widely, from platonic patronage centered on art and companionship to more intimate connections. Whatever the form, the dana system highlighted the dual nature of geisha life. At once independent and dependent, free in performance yet bound by economics. Despite these complexities, the geisha's role as an artist of atmosphere became increasingly valued. Banquets enlivened by geisha were spoken of with admiration, their laughter and music remembered long after the night ended. To host geisha was a mark of taste, a signal that one valued culture over mere indulgence. In this way, geisha elevated the entertainment quarters from sites of commerce to spaces of art. This elevation was reinforced by the arts themselves. The shamisen, introduced to Japan in the 16th century, became the instrument most closely associated with geisha. Its sound, plucked, resonant, capable of both joy and melancholy, captured the essence of the floating world. Dance, too, became central, with geisha performing choreographies that blended elegance with restraint. Songs carried themes of love, longing, and the seasons, echoing the impermanence that defined Japanese aesthetics. Through these arts, geisha became custodians of tradition. They preserved dances that might otherwise have been lost, songs that might have faded, rituals that might have been forgotten. Their role extended beyond entertainment into the realm of cultural heritage. Patrons who invited geisha to their gatherings were not only seeking amusement, but aligning themselves with the refinement of tradition. As their presence grew, so too did their representation in art. Ukiyo prints, the woodblock images that captured the floating world, often depicted geisha in elegant poses, their faces serene, their gestures graceful. Writers included them in plays and stories, their presence evoking themes of impermanence and beauty. Through these depictions, the geisha entered the cultural imagination of Japan, becoming symbols of refinement not only within the districts, but across society. Still, life within the ukiyo remained demanding. Discipline was strict, rules unyielding, debts heavy. Not every woman who entered the system emerged as a celebrated geisha. Many faded into obscurity, their lives consumed by labor and obligation. Yet even in these hardships, the profession endured. Its traditions passed down through generations, its image refined through repetition, its essence preserved by the very rules that constrained it. By the early 19th century, the distinction between courtesan and geisha was firmly established. Courtesans continued their parades, their extravagance dazzling in the streets. Geisha, by contrast, moved quietly through the lantern-lit alleys, their art unfolding within the intimate rooms of tea houses. The courtesan embodied spectacle. The geisha embodied grace. Both belonged to the floating world, but it was the geisha whose role would endure, adapting to the currents of modernity while the courtesans slowly disappeared. The story of this emergence is not merely one of restriction and survival, but of transformation. By embracing boundaries, geisha turned limitations into strengths. By cultivating subtlety, they created a form of beauty that could outlast extravagance. By focusing on art, they secured a place in history as more than entertainers, as symbols of refinement, as guardians of tradition, as muses of impermanence. The life of a geisha, while bound by rules and discipline, unfolded most vividly in the evenings, when she stepped into the warm glow of lanterns and the hush of tatami-matted rooms. It was here, in the gatherings known as ozashiki, that her art came alive. To understand the world of the geisha, one must step into these banquets, where refinement, playfulness, and atmosphere blended into a single experience. An ozashiki was never simply a meal. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, an evening in which every detail carried meaning. Guests, often wealthy merchants, samurai, or scholars, would arrive at a tea house, greeted by the rustle of sliding doors and the scent of incense lingering in the air. The rooms were spare yet elegant, tatami mats underfoot, paper lanterns casting a soft glow, sliding screens painted with seasonal motifs. In this setting, the arrival of the geisha was an event in itself. She would enter with quiet steps, bowing with grace, her kimono arranged in folds of subtle beauty, her face serene yet attentive. A maiko might accompany her, more vibrant in color and energy, her presence like a blossom alongside the calm of the full bloom. Together, they set the tone for the evening, their movements and gestures weaving the invisible threads of atmosphere. The evening unfolded in layers. At first, there was conversation, light, witty, attentive to the moods of the guests. A geisha was trained to draw people out, to balance voices so no one felt neglected, to turn silence into laughter, to make even the most awkward guest feel at ease. Her words were never careless. They were chosen with the precision of a poet, delivered with the rhythm of music. Then came the arts. The shamisen was lifted, its strings plucked to release melodies that were at once playful and haunting. Songs were sung, some traditional, some improvised, their lyrics often reflecting the seasons or the fleeting beauty of the moment. Dances followed, choreographed yet seemingly effortless. The movement of sleeves and steps painting patterns across the floor. Guests watched, entranced not only by the performance, but by the atmosphere it created, a sense that time itself had slowed, that the outside world no longer existed. Games, too, played an important role. Geisha were masters of small amusements, playful competitions designed to draw laughter and camaraderie. A cup of sake might pass from hand to hand, a chant rising with each turn, until someone slipped and laughter erupted. These games were not trivial. They were carefully chosen to dissolve barriers, to turn strangers into companions, to create a shared memory that lingered long after the night ended. The geisha's genius lay in the seamless blending of these elements. She was not a performer on a distant stage, but a presence among her guests, her art woven into the fabric of the evening itself. Conversation flowed into music, music into dance, dance into laughter, laughter into quiet reflection. Every shift of mood was guided by her skill, every moment shaped by her presence. For the guests, this experience was more than entertainment. It was a form of release. In the rigid structure of Tokugawa society, men were bound by duty, status, and formality. In the company of geisha, those bonds loosened. A merchant could laugh freely without worrying about appearances. A samurai could speak without the weight of hierarchy. A scholar could share his poetry without fear of judgment. Within the walls of the tea house, status dissolved, and all were united in the fleeting joy of the evening. This was the true art of the geisha: to create a space where life could be lived in its most luminous form, if only for a few hours. She did not promise love, nor possession, nor permanence. She offered something subtler, yet more profound: the memory of beauty, the taste of joy, the echo of music that lingered long after the shamisen had fallen silent. The structure of an ozashiki reflected this philosophy. There was no script, no rigid program. The evening flowed naturally, guided by the moods of the guests and the intuition of the geisha. If conversation grew heavy, she introduced a song. If laughter faded, she began a dance. If silence fell, she filled it with wit. Her role was not to dominate, but to balance; not to display, but to harmonize. She was the invisible conductor of an orchestra made of people, atmosphere, and art. Behind the apparent ease of these evenings lay immense preparation. Geisha spent hours dressing, arranging hair, applying makeup, rehearsing music and dance. Their kimono were chosen with care, the patterns reflecting season and occasion. Every detail was designed to convey elegance without extravagance, refinement without ostentation. The illusion of effortlessness was itself the product of discipline, a mastery that transformed years of training into the lightness of a smile. For the Maiko, these evenings were classrooms. They watched their older sisters carefully, learning when to speak, when to remain silent, when to draw attention, and when to yield it. They practiced small roles, serving sake, playing simple tunes, joining in games, gradually building the confidence to step into the spotlight themselves. The ozashiki was both a stage and a school, a place where art and apprenticeship blended seamlessly. Guests often spoke of the feeling that lingered after an evening with geisha. It was not the memory of a particular song or dance, nor even the details of conversation. It was the atmosphere, the sense of having stepped outside ordinary time, of having touched something fleeting yet profound. In this, the geisha embodied the Japanese aesthetic ideal of impermanence, of beauty that exists precisely because it cannot last. The world outside the tea house might be filled with duty, hardship, and hierarchy. But inside, for a few hours, there was only art, laughter, and the quiet glow of lantern light. The geisha made this world possible, not by erasing reality, but by transforming it, by turning ordinary moments into memories that seemed eternal. It is little wonder that patrons returned again and again, not for possession, but for presence. The courtesans promised the body, the geisha promised the soul. And in a world hungry for moments of beauty, it was the geisha who offered the nourishment most deeply desired. The rise of the female geisha did more than transform the entertainment districts. It reshaped the social imagination of Japan itself. By the turn of the 19th century, geisha were no longer seen only as figures of fleeting amusement. They had become cultural icons, women whose presence carried meanings far beyond the walls of the tea houses. Their influence reached into art, literature, and even the structures of society, challenging perceptions of gender and class in ways both subtle and profound. In a world where most women were confined to domestic spaces, the geisha lived in a sphere of visibility. She walked the lantern-lit alleys of Kyoto's Gion or Edo's Yoshiwara, recognizable by her attire, her poise, her presence. Men of every rank sought her company, from powerful daimyo to humble merchants. She spoke with them as an equal, her wit and knowledge giving her a voice rarely afforded to women of her time. This visibility gave the geisha a paradoxical status. She was both celebrated and restricted, admired for her refinement, yet bound by rules that defined her life. Public perception of geisha varied. To many, they were symbols of grace, embodying the highest ideals of Japanese aesthetics: elegance, subtlety, impermanence. Artists and writers celebrated them in ukiyo prints and stories, their images spreading beyond the pleasure quarters into the broader cultural imagination. To encounter a geisha, even in art, was to touch the essence of the floating world, to glimpse a beauty that existed precisely because it could not last. But there were also critics. Some viewed geisha with suspicion, believing their presence undermined morality, that their companionship blurred the boundaries between art and desire. Authorities continued to regulate them strictly, fearful that they might disrupt social order. Yet, even these criticisms reinforced the uniqueness of the geisha's role. She was neither wife nor courtesan, neither wholly respectable nor wholly illicit. She occupied a space in between, defined not by conventional categories, but by her art itself. This liminal position gave geisha a certain power. Because they existed outside the strict hierarchies of class and gender, they could move between worlds. A geisha might spend an evening entertaining samurai, then the next hosting merchants, then the next sharing poetry with scholars. In each setting, she adapted, her presence shaping itself to the company she kept. Few others in Tokugawa Japan could move so fluidly across boundaries. In this way, geisha became not only entertainers, but bridges between classes, their art softening the divisions that otherwise ruled society. The role of the dana further complicated this social position. For a geisha to secure a patron was both an economic necessity and a mark of status. A wealthy merchant or nobleman who became her dana signaled his own refinement and generosity. In return, the geisha gained financial stability and a degree of independence from her ukiyo. Yet these relationships were not without tension. They blurred the line between art and intimacy, independence and dependence, professionalism and personal connection. Some geisha navigated these arrangements skillfully, maintaining their dignity and autonomy. Others found themselves trapped by obligations that eroded their freedom. Despite these challenges, geisha culture flourished because it offered something rare, a form of companionship that transcended the ordinary. Guests came not only for music and dance, but for conversation that was witty, playful, and often deeply insightful. A geisha was expected to know poetry, to understand current events, to engage in philosophical banter as easily as she could pour sake. She was, in many ways, a conversationalist as much as a performer, her art rooted as much in intellect as in grace. This intellectual role distinguished geisha from other entertainers. Courtesans dazzled with spectacle, actors with drama, musicians with skill. Geisha, by contrast, wove all these elements into the subtle fabric of human interaction. Her performance was never separate from her guests. It was always in dialogue with them, shaped by their moods, guided by their reactions. In this sense, the geisha was not simply an artist, but a curator of atmosphere, a sculptor of social experience. The spread of geisha culture into art reinforced their symbolic weight. Ukiyo prints by artists like Utamaro captured their faces in delicate lines, their kimonos flowing, their expressions serene yet enigmatic. These images circulated widely, carried not only within Japan but eventually to the West, where they would shape foreign perceptions of Japanese femininity for centuries. Writers and poets composed verses in their honor, describing evenings of music and laughter that seemed to hover forever in memory. Through these representations, the geisha became more than individuals. They became symbols of refinement itself. Yet the daily realities of geisha life were far more complex than their images suggested. Beneath the serene exterior lay a world of labor, discipline, and financial struggle. The cost of kimono alone was staggering, each piece requiring investment far beyond what most ordinary families could imagine. The endless lessons, the obligations to the ukiyo, the demands of guests, all combined to create a life that was as exhausting as it was beautiful. For every celebrated geisha whose name became legend, there were many more who lived quietly, their contributions unnoticed, their lives consumed by debt and discipline. Still, the very fragility of their world gave it meaning. The geisha embodied the aesthetic of impermanence not only in art, but in life itself. Their beauty was fleeting, their careers often short, their presence bound to youth and refinement that faded with time. And yet, within this transience, they created something lasting. Memories, traditions, symbols that would endure even after individual names were forgotten. By the early 19th century, the geisha stood at a crossroads. Their profession was secure, their image celebrated, their arts recognized. They had survived suspicion, carved out a distinct identity, and risen to prominence in the floating world. Yet greater changes loomed on the horizon. Changes that would test their adaptability, challenge their traditions, and reshape their role in Japanese society. Modernization, Western influence, and the upheavals of a new age were coming. But before those storms arrived, the geisha of the late 18th and early 19th centuries enjoyed a moment of equilibrium, a time when their role was defined, their presence celebrated, their art flourishing. They had become the muses of the floating world, the symbols of impermanence, the keepers of elegance in a society yearning for beauty. In their laughter, their music, their dances, they captured the essence of an age, a world balanced delicately between duty and pleasure, tradition and change, reality and illusion. By the dawn of the 19th century, the geisha had passed through her uncertain beginnings and stood as a firmly established presence in Japanese society. What had once been a marginal role in the entertainment districts had matured into an institution, governed by rules, enriched by tradition, and celebrated in the cultural imagination of the nation. She was no longer an experiment of the floating world, but its very embodiment, a figure through which refinement and impermanence were expressed in human form. The consolidation of geisha culture during this period was remarkable. The apprenticeship system, with its stages of shikomi, maiko, and geisha, had crystallized into a pattern recognizable even today. The appearance of geisha was standardized. The subdued kimono, the restrained hairstyles, the elegance of movement that contrasted so sharply with the extravagance of the courtesans. Their training, too, was codified, ensuring continuity across generations. A geisha of Kyoto and a geisha of Edo might differ in local customs, but both shared the same essential arts of music, dance, conversation, and etiquette. This standardization gave geisha culture a durability that few other professions in the floating world could claim. Courtesans, once dominant, began to decline in prominence as their elaborate rituals fell out of step with the shifting tastes of patrons. Kabuki actors flourished, but their art was tied to the stage and could not adapt easily to intimate gatherings. The geisha, by contrast, thrived precisely because her art was fluid, adaptable, woven seamlessly into the fabric of social life. The tea houses, or ochaya, became the heart of this world. These establishments were not brothels, but refined spaces where geisha performed and entertained, managed by proprietors who understood the delicate balance of hospitality and discretion. Ochaya provided the setting for ozashiki banquets. Guests entered not to seek possession, but to enjoy atmosphere. Music, laughter, conversation, and the gentle presence of geisha. The ochaya thus became sanctuaries of refinement, places where art and companionship mingled in ways that elevated the spirit. Within the ochaya, the role of the geisha expanded. She was no longer simply a performer, but also a mediator of social interaction. She guided conversation, balanced the dynamics of the group, ensured that each guest felt included. Her presence softened tensions, bridged differences of class, and created harmony among diverse company. In this way, geisha became not only artists, but subtle agents of social cohesion, shaping the mood of gatherings in ways both visible and invisible. This role carried symbolic weight. In a society marked by strict hierarchies and rigid codes of behavior, the geisha represented a rare space of fluidity. Within the walls of the tea house, a merchant could jest with a samurai. A scholar could laugh with a soldier. A poet could drink with a politician. Status was not erased, but suspended, replaced by the currency of wit, grace, and refinement. The geisha presided over this suspension, ensuring that the fleeting moment was preserved in memory as luminous and complete. The cultural significance of geisha was reinforced by their prominence in art. Woodblock prints captured their images with increasing frequency, presenting them as icons of elegance. The subtle tilt of the head, the sweep of a sleeve, the delicate arrangement of hair. These details became visual shorthand for refinement itself. Writers described evenings with geisha in prose and poetry, their words filled with admiration for the atmosphere created by these women of art. Through such representations, the geisha entered not only the floating world, but the collective imagination of Japan. Yet the profession remained demanding. Behind the serenity of the geisha's public face lay a world of discipline, labor, and financial obligation. The cost of maintaining appearances was immense. Kimono, hair ornaments, lessons, and daily living expenses all accumulated into debts owed to the ukiyo. A successful geisha might secure a dana to support her. But even then, obligations were heavy and independence limited. For many, the life of refinement was shadowed by hardship. Their beauty and art balanced precariously against economic necessity. Still, The resilience of geisha culture was undeniable. The very rules that constrained them also protected their identity. By forbidding them from selling intimacy, by regulating their appearance, by structuring their training, the authorities had inadvertently preserved the geisha as a distinct figure. While courtesans faded into obscurity, the geisha endured, their art adapting to the changing times without losing its essence. By the early 19th century, districts like Kyoto's Gion and Edo's Shinbashi had become renowned for their geisha. Travelers spoke of the elegance of these women, of the evenings spent in their company, of the memories that lingered long after departure. Foreign visitors, when they began to trickle into Japan, were often struck by the figure of the geisha, though their interpretations varied wildly. To the Japanese, however, she was clear. A woman of art, of refinement, of impermanence, embodying the values of a culture that prized subtlety over spectacle, suggestion over display. This period of consolidation can be seen as the foundation of the geisha's endurance. Without it, the profession might have vanished alongside other aspects of the floating world. Instead, the geisha survived by adapting, by transforming limitations into strengths, by embracing restraint as elegance, and by embedding themselves into the cultural heritage of Japan. Thus, on the eve of modernization, the geisha stood as one of the most enduring symbols of Japanese refinement. Her art was fragile yet resilient, ephemeral yet lasting, bound by rules yet filled with freedom. She was the paradox of the floating world made flesh, a living reminder that beauty, though fleeting, could illuminate eternity within the span of a single evening. The early 19th century was not only a time of consolidation for the geisha as a profession. It was also a time when their image became deeply embedded in the arts and philosophy of Japan. To understand their role fully, one must step beyond the walls of the tea houses and into the wider cultural imagination, where geisha were celebrated as symbols of elegance, impermanence, and refined beauty. In ukiyo, the woodblock prints that defined the visual culture of the Edo period, geisha appeared with striking frequency. Artists like Kitagawa Utamaro, famed for his delicate portraits of women, captured them with subtle lines and careful attention to detail. The prints did not simply reproduce their likenesses. They elevated them into icons. A geisha in an Utamaro print was not just an entertainer. She was the embodiment of refinement, her poise and elegance serving as metaphors for the values of the floating world. The poses were telling. A tilt of the head, a half smile, the gentle fall of hair across the neck, all suggested a world of emotion without stating it directly. The prints conveyed not spectacle but suggestion, not drama but quiet grace. This mirrored the very essence of geisha performance. The power of understatement. The beauty of what is implied rather than declared. Still, the resilience of geisha culture was undeniable. The very rules that constrained them also protected their identity. By forbidding them from selling intimacy, by regulating their appearance, by structuring their training, the authorities had inadvertently preserved the geisha as a distinct figure. While courtesans faded into obscurity, the geisha endured, their art adapting to the changing times without losing its essence. By the early 19th century, districts like Kyoto's Gion and Edo's Shinbashi had become renowned for their geisha. Travelers spoke of the elegance of these women, of the evenings spent in their company, of the memories that lingered long after departure. Foreign visitors, when they began to trickle into Japan, were often struck by the figure of the geisha, though their interpretations varied wildly. To the Japanese, however, she was clear. A woman of art, of refinement, of impermanence, embodying the values of a culture that prized subtlety over spectacle, suggestion over display. This period of consolidation can be seen as the foundation of the geisha's endurance. Without it, the profession might have vanished alongside other aspects of the floating world. Instead, the geisha survived by adapting, by transforming limitations into strengths, by embracing restraint as elegance, and by embedding themselves into the cultural heritage of Japan. Thus, on the eve of modernization, the geisha stood as one of the most enduring symbols of Japanese refinement. Her art was fragile yet resilient, ephemeral yet lasting, bound by rules yet filled with freedom. She was the paradox of the floating world made flesh, a living reminder that beauty, though fleeting, could illuminate eternity within the span of a single evening. The early 19th century was not only a time of consolidation for the geisha as a profession. It was also a time when their image became deeply embedded in the arts and philosophy of Japan. To understand their role fully, one must step beyond the walls of the tea houses and into the wider cultural imagination, where geisha were celebrated as symbols of elegance, impermanence, and refined beauty. In ukiyo, the woodblock prints that defined the visual culture of the Edo period, geisha appeared with striking frequency. Artists like Kitagawa Utamaro, famed for his delicate portraits of women, captured them with subtle lines and careful attention to detail. The prints did not simply reproduce their likenesses. They elevated them into icons. A geisha in an Utamaro print was not just an entertainer. She was the embodiment of refinement, her poise and elegance serving as metaphors for the values of the floating world. The poses were telling. A tilt of the head, a half smile, the gentle fall of hair across the neck, all suggested a world of emotion without stating it directly. The prints conveyed not spectacle but suggestion, not drama but quiet grace. This mirrored the very essence of geisha performance. The power of understatement. The beauty of what is implied rather than declared. Writers, too, found in geisha a source of inspiration. They appeared in plays, in poems, in essays, often as figures who embodied the fleeting beauty of life. Their laughter, their dances, their conversations were described with a sense of longing, as though the writers knew that what they sought to capture would always slip away. The geisha became a muse not only for her patrons, but for an entire generation of artists, her presence shaping the aesthetics of an era. Underlying this artistic fascination was a deeper philosophy, the Japanese appreciation for impermanence, known as mono no aware. This phrase, often translated as the pathos of things, refers to the bittersweet awareness that beauty is fleeting, that all things pass, and that it is precisely their transience that makes them precious. The cherry blossom, blooming in brilliance only to fall within days, became the central metaphor for this sensibility. And the geisha, with her youth, her art, her presence that could never be possessed, embodied the same truth. An evening with a geisha was a living expression of mono no aware. The laughter would fade, the music would end, the lanterns would be extinguished. But the memory lingered, suffused with the awareness that it could never be repeated. Guests left with a sense of longing, not because they had been denied, but because they had been given something that could only exist once. The geisha's art was thus inseparable from impermanence. It was not meant to endure, but to shine brightly in its moment and then vanish. This philosophy distinguished geisha culture from Western notions of art and beauty. In Europe, the courtesan or actress might be celebrated for fame, for permanence, for records of achievement. In Japan, the geisha was celebrated for transience, for the fleeting nature of her presence, for the way she embodied impermanence itself. She was not a monument, but a moment, not a legacy, but a memory. And yet, paradoxically, it was precisely this impermanence that gave her endurance, for she aligned herself with the deepest currents of Japanese thought. The artistic fascination with geisha extended beyond their images and into the very structure of Japanese art forms. In haiku poetry, with its brevity and seasonal references, the sensibility of the geisha's world found resonance. A single image, a lantern reflected on water, a shamisen string vibrating in silence, captured the essence of an evening as surely as any banquet. In kabuki theater, too, geisha sometimes appeared as characters, their presence lending authenticity and refinement to the plays. But perhaps the most profound impact was in the way geisha influenced the perception of femininity itself. In a society where women were often confined to roles of wife and mother, the geisha offered an alternative vision, a woman whose value lay not in domestic duty, but in cultivated art, not in permanence, but in presence. She was at once traditional and unconventional, bound by rules, yet free in ways that others were not. This paradox fascinated observers, making her a subject of endless discussion and representation. The geisha's integration into cultural imagination also reinforced her legitimacy. By appearing in prints, plays, and poems, she was no longer confined to the narrow alleys of the entertainment districts. She became part of the larger cultural heritage of Japan, a symbol recognized far beyond the walls of the tea house. Patrons sought her not only for companionship, but for the prestige of association with a figure so deeply woven into the nation's artistic fabric. Still, this symbolic weight carried burdens. The idealized image of the geisha often obscured the realities of her life. The debts, the discipline, the exhaustion, the limitations imposed by society. Artists captured her serenity, but rarely her struggles. Writers praised her elegance, but seldom her hardships. The cultural imagination elevated her into a symbol, but in doing so, it sometimes erased her humanity. Yet perhaps this too was part of the paradox. The geisha lived as both individual and symbol, her personal life intertwined with the expectations of culture. She bore the weight of ideals larger than herself, embodying impermanence not only in art, but in her own existence. Her struggles, like her performances, were fleeting, soon forgotten, leaving behind only the memory of refinement. By the mid-19th century, the geisha had become inseparable from Japan's self-image. She was the muse of the floating world, the embodiment of impermanence, the symbol of refinement. Her presence in art and philosophy ensured that she would endure, even as society itself began to change. For beyond the walls of the tea houses, beyond the glow of lanterns, beyond the music of shamisen, new currents were stirring, currents of modernization, of Western influence, of upheavals that would challenge the very foundations of Japanese tradition. But for a time, before those storms arrived, The geisha of the early 19th century stood at the height of her symbolic power. She was the cherry blossom in full bloom, the moon reflected on still water, the echo of music fading into silence. She was impermanence made visible, and in her fleeting presence lay the enduring truth of beauty itself. Thank you, dear listener, for staying with me on this first part of our journey through the history of the geisha. Together, we have walked through their origins, their early transformations, and the beginnings of the traditions that would carry them across centuries. But this story is far from over. In the next chapter, we will move even deeper into their world, exploring how their art, their rules, and their communities shaped the floating world of Japan. If this story has brought you calm or inspiration, please let me know in the comments and share where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next part of this journey into the secret and timeless world of the geisha. Until then, may your nights be peaceful, your days gentle, and your path filled with quiet beauty.